This is the second video on development economics. The first was focused on how to measure development, focusing mostly on the Human Development Index, but this video will focus on the driving forces and obstacles to development. But before I get on to that, I just wanted to remind you that when answering a question from AQA on development, it is essential you focus your answer on the ways of measuring development. So when considering driving forces for development and obstacles to development, you still need to focus on the impacts of this on the measurements of what is included, for example, in the Human Development Index. So let's start with the driving forces of development. So the first one that I'm going to focus on is globalization. So globalization, increased integration of national economies through trade and investment and technology transfers can create opportunities for development. So if you think about multinational enterprises, which was actually mentioned in that example question on the previous slide, multinationals have been at the forefront of changes in the global economy as transportation and communication costs have declined, technologies have facilitated more complex operations, and trade and investment barriers have lessened over the last few decades. So globalization has assisted this, but also multinationals have been the driving force for globalization. So it provides opportunities for development. So if we think about multinationals add to the host country's GDP through their spending. Example, that could be with local suppliers and through capital investments. So multinationals also act as an incentive to domestic firms to improve their competitiveness, perhaps by raising quality, efficiency, and standards. So if you think about multinationals, not only do they create jobs, but they also raise the labour standards in countries. So foreign-owned and subcontracted manufacturing firms, for example, in poor nations, tend to pay higher wages than local firms, which then help to raise the average wage in such countries. Another driving force is investment. So that could be domestic or it could be foreign direct investment, and that can stimulate economic growth. And the role of multinational corporations in transferring that technology and helping to build infrastructure can be crucial for development. Obviously, what that investment will do is it'll boost capital within that country, which can then help with long-term growth. There's also government policies. So governments play an essential and critical role in promoting development. They can set tax policies which are favourable to try and help attract, for example, foreign direct investment. Also in terms of the allocation of resources, in terms of government expenditure, that could be in terms of the provision of merit goods or the provision of public goods, which again can be not only helpful in the development of that country, but it can also attract investment, which then also plays its role in development. Unfortunately, the government can also play a role in obstacles to development, which I will consider later. But within these driving forces, governments, if they allocate the resources effectively, then they can really promote development. There's also human capital. So again, I've mentioned about the provision of merit goods. If that provision of merit goods is based on education, then the education of skills of a population are critical. A well-educated and skilled workforce obviously contributes towards growth, which aids development. We've also got natural resources. So the availability of resources such as minerals, oils and gas can be a significant factor in the development of an economy, especially helping to fund development. So if the government owns such resources and allocates these resources effectively to promote development, which has not always been the case, then they can promote export opportunities, they can help to achieve revenue for the country, as well as creating employment and using such funds to develop infrastructure. So let's think of an example. If we consider the UAE, the discovery of vast oil and gas reserves in the UAE roughly in the 1950s provided a significant boost to its economy. So the country is one of the largest oil reserves in the world and has become one of the leading oil producing countries. And in 1971, the control of oil was centralised under the federal government, which enabled them to negotiate better terms with foreign oil companies and to invest more in developing its oil and gas sector. So based on this, they were able to use this money to diversify, taking advantage of their strategic location, and their Human Development Index has risen dramatically. So in 2021, it had a HDI of 0.929, which is significantly high, but in the 1980s, it was roughly 0.64. Now, let's consider the obstacles or the barriers to development. So I've already mentioned the issues of government, and I was hinting at corruption. So now the Corruption Perception Index enables us to measure how countries can be perceived to be corrupt. Clearly, it's very, very difficult to measure corruption due to the hidden elements, but we can perceive it, and we can perceive how corrupt countries might be. So if countries are perceived to be corrupt, this will discourage investment. So the Transparency Organisation updates the index annually, and a score of 100 is very clean, in other words, not perceived to be corrupt, whilst a score of 0 is perceived to be fully corrupt. So we've got Somalia, and this is considered to be the most corrupt country in terms of perception. But when actually considering the Human Development Index of Somalia, they do not possess a rank. And the reason they don't possess a rank is because there's not enough data available to calculate it. So Somalia has been affected by conflict and political instability for many years, which has made it difficult to collect reliable data. The lack of a functional government and the ongoing conflicts have made it challenging to gather accurate and comprehensive data on the country's population and the economy. So the United Nations Development Programme has not been able to calculate a HDI rank for Somalia in recent years. Now, the lack of that HDI rank underscores the challenges that Somalia faces in achieving sustainable human development and highlights the urgent need for international support and investment to address these challenges. But what it also does, it kind of puts emphasis and weight on this perception of corruption and how this corruption might be creating barriers as well. Now, we've got in the joint second in corruption is Syria and South Sudan. Now, Syria again has no HDI data available, while South Sudan has a HDI of 0.385, which is a ranking of 191 out of 191 countries. So you can see kind of the trend there. Now, the diversion of resources. If you think about corruption, corrupt officials may use their positions of power to divert resources away from the productive uses and towards personal gain, such as through embezzlements or bribes. So this can limit the amount of resources available for investment in key sectors, whether that's education, healthcare, and infrastructure. It obviously reduces investment, so corruption can discourage foreign and domestic investment by increasing the perceived risk of doing business in that country. So this can limit the availability of capital for businesses and entrepreneurs, particularly in, obviously, these emerging markets. Again, talking about inefficient allocation of resources, corruption can lead to that inefficient allocation of resources, as officials may prioritise projects that provide personal gain over those that have the greatest economic or social benefits. And this can obviously lead to a misallocation of resources, reduced productivity, lower economic growth, which then obviously causes problems with development. And impaired public services. So corruption can lead to reduced quality and availability of public services such as healthcare, education, as resources are diverted again away from these sectors. This can have a particularly negative impact on vulnerable populations such as those who are poor and marginalised. Now, if we consider the countries that got the highest, in terms of the highest score, meaning that they are less corrupt, we have got Denmark, we've got Finland, we've got New Zealand. And they're obviously developed countries. So what you tend to find, usually on trends, the more developed countries have the lowest perception of risk in terms of corruption. Now, another obstacle that we need to consider is high levels of debt, especially regarding national debt. So from Argentina to Zimbabwe, soaring debt levels have severely exposed many developing countries to global economic and financial volatility, regardless of their income levels. So the high levels of indebtedness means that there is reduced room to manoeuvre when external shocks come. So a growing number of developing countries are at severe risk of defaulting on their external debt amidst the spiral in inflation that we've experienced in the last year. So tightening financial conditions and a higher likelihood of a global recession. So a significant number of both low and middle income countries have seen their debt servicing costs rise well above 20% of annual government revenues, which then creates a big opportunity cost in terms of being able to spend. So in late May 2022, the IMF assessed that 55% of the 69 low-income countries eligible for concessional financial support were at high risk of or already in debt distress. compared with just 30% in 2015. So debt distress is where countries are unable to fulfill their financial obligations, leading to debt restructuring. This, in turn, raises the risk of these countries facing higher borrowing costs if they need to borrow, and losing access to international capital markets. So just to put this into context and to have a bit of comparison, back in 1980, the total debt of emerging markets and developing economies stood at 65% of GDP, which already led to a debt crisis in, for example, Latin America and African countries. But according to the World Bank data cited by UNSTAD, by 2020, this debt to GDP ratio has reached 207%. Right, the other one that we're going to look at is energy poverty. And this is a term used to describe the lack of access to modern energy services that are essential for basic human needs. So calculations show that more than half of the people in LDC still lacked access to electricity in 2019. So about 570 million men, women and children in these countries don't have light at night for reading and are able to charge their mobile phone. The situation is obviously worse in rural areas, with about 2/3 of the population, so roughly 458 million people, living without electricity. And where electricity is available, such as in large cities, access is often unreliable. So this clearly reduces productivity and hurts gross domestic product. Then obviously that impacts upon development. Now, one recent example has been with COVID-19 and the COVID-19 crisis. Without reliable electricity, hospitals were not able to refrigerate vaccines. Now, this obviously hampers the vaccine rollout efforts, putting them more at risk of the pandemic. So the next barrier that we're going to look at is the environment and climate. So LDCs are on the front lines of the climate crisis, even though their populations have barely contributed to the global greenhouse gas emissions, fueling global heating. So, in the past 5 decades, these vulnerable nations have been home to 69% of the global deaths caused by climate disasters. Yet their cars, their industries have only produced 1.1% of the world's total CO2 emissions. Even their share per person barely reaches 9% of the world's average. So in 2019, the carbon footprint of an average person living in an LDC was 23 times smaller than that of someone in a developed country such as the US or an EU nation. This climate apartheid means that these people least responsible for climate change are the most affected by its consequences. And you also have to consider the cost. So the poorest countries face the greatest risk from climate change and require international support to finance adaptation. Because obviously this climate change is going to have long-term impacts on their growth. It's going to destroy capital, it'll destroy labour, and it's going to obviously harm productivity in the short term and long term. So, long-term savings from investment in resilience and coping mechanisms are needed. That includes better irrigation, improved seed varieties, strengthened health systems, and greater access to finance and telecommunications. That will all be very, very significant, especially, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa experiences 1/3 of the world's droughts and is particularly vulnerable to rising temperatures and extreme weather because of its dependence on rain-fed agriculture. So it's researched that a single drought can lower an African country's medium-term economic growth potential by 1 percentage point. So some countries are facing and will face daunting costs already. So research by the IMF and others suggests public adaptation costs will reach around 0.25% of global gross domestic product per year in coming decades. While such estimates can appear manageable at the global level, they aren't representative of the scale of the challenge faced by many poor and vulnerable countries. So estimations that the annual needs exceed 1% of GDP in about 50 low-income and developing economies for the next 10 years. So the cost can even be larger for small island nations which are exposed to tropical cyclones and rising seas, and that can be up to 20% of GDP. Right, the final barrier that we're going to look at the second to last one actually, or it kind of links, they're linked together, and it's to do with global trade. So LDCs also remain marginalised in global trade. So their share of global merchandise exports have hovered around just 1% since 2010. Their main export leaves them highly vulnerable to global crisis and shocks. So they're commodity dependent, And these countries are being urged to try and diversify their exports, but obviously that's challenging when you're a low-income country. So today, 67% of developing countries, so that's 91 out of 135 countries, are dependent on commodities. And that's a situation that's changed very little in the last 2 decades. So least developed countries are even more dependent, as more than 80% of their export earnings come from commodities. So heavy dependence on commodities make these countries vulnerable to shocks and price fluctuations. So a decline in commodity prices can have a negative impact on export and fiscal revenues and may slow down economic growth and development. So although several LDCs have broadened their export base, as many as 38 of them remain commodity dependent. They rely on primary goods like copper, cotton, oil for over 60% of their merchandise exports. So global commodity markets are going to be very volatile, and when prices crash, so do obviously exports, jobs and government revenue, which is going to be catastrophic for these low-income countries. So this volatility is obviously a very serious threat to many LDCs.